with like LLMs and AI and stuff, I think what will probably become more important is kind of thinking in this way and writing in a way, I guess, kind of modular docs. So you kind of have a little bit more separation of concern, because I guess the idea is that the LLM could put these pieces together if they're kind of organized in a consistent way. The people you're writing for are people. They're at the end of the day. And I think it's good to just kind of have that in mind when you're writing docs for them, that they're people like you that are trying to do something. Yeah, and I guess one reason I think I like this career, this role, is like writing good docs could help people and at least make their day a little bit better.
So welcome to the API to Docs podcast. My name is Laura Wasch. I'm going to be the host today, and my guest is Ryan Young from Stripe. Thank you, Ryan, for accepting the invitation, and welcome.
Oh, well, thank you for the invite.
And the story behind this invitation is that I have had the honor of hearing Ryan's presentation, I guess, for the first time at Write the Docs in 2023 in Portland, where he talked about the layer cake of documentation. And I was really fascinated with that. And after that, I caught you in the cafeteria or the place where you can have coffee, and very abruptly asked you whether you want to be a podcast guest, at which you were like, maybe? I don't know who you are, but okay, maybe. So thank you for accepting this.
Yeah. Like I said, it's honors all mine. So thank you for asking.
And this is only audio, but I'm seeing Ryan on a video. And behind you, I see 2 guitars, I think, and 3 guitar holders. So there might be a 3rd guitar hiding somewhere. That means that you are a musician also?
I guess so, in that I do play guitar, sort of, and I bought a lot of guitars. I don't really play any other instruments, but I do enjoy playing the guitar.
And this is not like collecting yarn and knitting are 2 separate hobbies. This is collecting guitars is the same as playing music, right?
I guess that's true. Yes, when I practice, I'm playing music, so I guess we can count that.
Do you play in a band?
I don't. I only started learning a few years ago. I bought a guitar a long time ago, and then when I had a kid, I kind of thought I should at least learn how to play a little bit, and I started. I really liked it, and just kind of kept on going. So.
Okay, so the guitars don't look like you play just a little bit. I think you're just very, very humble about this. Just like about your professional career, because you wrote to me that you were just a technical writer at Stripe, which is okay. I remember on the conference, the introduction was people want to be you when they grow up. You are staff technical writer at Stripe. Is that still the case?
Yes, that's still my role there, yeah.
Can you tell me what happened in your career before, in a nutshell? How did you arrive to this point? And why did you become a technical writer?
I kind of fell into it. I think like a lot of technical writers, it wasn't necessarily my goal, but I had majored in English and I was doing a graduate program in English. And through that, I kind of got a job at a software company where a friend's wife was working. And I started there as kind of like a administrative assistant, kind of helping with like sales operations and things like that. And at some point, I was, I guess, just out of college, so like mid-20s, and someone there said something along the lines of perceptively that like I don't look like a salesperson. I'm probably not going to like become a sales executive or anything like that. That's just kind of not my personality. But she noticed that I was detail oriented. I was a good writer and communicator. So she was like, maybe you want to try it. Tech pubs is what it was called there. So I took that chance and kind of learned on the job, and worked at that initial company for a while, and then bounced around to like several other kind of 1-2 year stretches. And then eventually I got kind of an opportunity at kind of a startup, and was there for about 6 years and kind of helped build up their kind of initial like doc set and docs tooling and things like that, and really learned a lot, especially around docs as code, because it was, just working very directly with developers. And there was one other tech writer there who was basically a developer as well. So yeah, I think from that really learned kind of like all the different pieces that are required, somewhat in miniature just because of the scale of the company at that time. But I think it was really useful to kind of have to get get down in the weeds for like learning how to like set up like CI/CD stuff and these deployment things that, or a lot of the time, I think like tech writers sort of like we're very abstracted from, it's just like kind of you push a button and then things happen. So, and not that it has like necessarily like any directly applicable things. Like I don't run deployments on a day-to-day basis, but I think, like I said, it helps kind of give like a holistic view of what's required and things to think about. And then about 2.5 years ago, I came over to Stripe as a staff technical writer and have just been doing that. And I think a lot of the stuff I've been thinking about is laid out in the presentation. And yeah, I mean, I think the thing with Stripe is that it's just grown to the point where it just there's so much to it. We have a lot of like really great quick start guides and things like that, and very like detail oriented guides and like a really great API reference. Where people are getting stuck is the people who aren't necessarily like the developers who go right to the API reference, the people who are somewhere in between, and they just want to know how to like fit different pieces together and things like that. So
so we're off topic now.
Yeah, sorry.
And this is
sorry, I guess I just naturally go towards that.
Well, let me hold the suspense for the listeners. But in this journey, when was the point where someone asks you what you do and you said, without the imposter syndrome, I'm a tech writer? When did that happen? Or you never had that? I mean, the imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
When did you start calling yourself a technical writer?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think now, I like, you mentioned, I just called myself a technical writer. I feel like that's something I could do now without too much cringing on my part. Yeah, and to be honest, in my previous role, I was a manager, so I did kind of struggle with that a bit because I discovered managing and technical writing are two kind of different disciplines.
Yeah.
And obviously it helps if you know technical writing. But yeah, honestly, I would say kind of just in the last couple of years have I really gotten comfortable saying that, and yeah, in a way, kind of embracing it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been a long journey. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a very different skill set in some ways, but if you look at it from a different point of view, your customers or your focus is still people. So the end result is more or less the same, that you want the good feelings to be evoked in people and to do what you would like them to do in a way. Yeah,
that's true. You're still kind of, I guess when you're writing docs, you're kind of hoping the doc will get the user to do what you hope is the right thing for them. And yeah, when you're managing, you're kind of trying to set things up to like for people to succeed and do good work. I can imagine like someone who looks from the doc side, if they are not pathologically introverts, they might become very good managers in a way of enabling people to get to the point, get it done, and move on. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And so you started talking about the presentation, which not everybody may have heard. For me, this was the thing that you were driving home. For me, what I heard was very obvious in hindsight, but it's also a bit controversial when it comes to diehard tech writer folks. And that is about, we usually talk about the high level documentation, and we often paste that like, the poor folks who don't know how to code, but they still have to do business. And then there's the low level one, this, for the nerds who actually know how to code. So there's these two different ways of patronizing people, but that they're still people. And then you say, yes, but there's a gaping hole in the middle when people they already have an idea of where they are, where they want to go, but they still want to make decisions before they dive deep. And then you talked about your aha moments of how you got to seeing where this is needed, and then how you implemented this at the Stripe Docs, I presume, together with your colleagues. Now, there was one thing that I was very fascinated, which you wrote, that docs are maps for users before they are instructions. And I love that. How do you get to this way of seeing docs? I think it kind of started in my last job at the last company, because there's kind of an extra layer of complexity that we had to deal with. It was a cryptocurrency company. So part of the task of docs was to explain how this cryptocurrency worked to some degree. And early on, I think like a lot of places, there's a lot of emphasis on explaining like the mechanics of the ledger and how the ledger worked and how you could like send, how these kind of different transactions work there, which is really fascinating if you're interested in it and you want to know if you maybe want to like write an app for it or write a trading bot or something like that. But if you are just a user who wants to like do something with it, you don't really need to know all the mechanics of that thing. You just need to know, you're in the request you send in and the what you're going to get out and what to do with that. And especially for something like that technology, which was, I mean, one of the problems was that there was so much that you could potentially do with it. It was kind of hard to figure out one particular use case to kind of focus on. So I think they eventually did, but I think while kind of working through all of that to kind of like balance that kind of like deep technical information and also just kind of like help users understand what this thing is, like what to do with it, what's expected of them. I ended up working really closely with like an instructional designer and some folks who work in the field with customers, like solution architects and different roles like that. And they really helped me understand when they talk to customers, this is what these users care about. Like this, because especially with like solution architects, they give them this whole picture that, you've probably seen diagrams of, these different systems interacting. And then that's just sort of what these users need to kind of get that's kind of their map where it's like, okay, I understand this, and they could kind of do the work from there.
How much did Zelda influence you?
At the time, I didn't know Zelda that well. So, but yeah, now I think that would be a good analogy.
And then, well, not cryptocurrency, but Stripe has similar. The deeper you go, the more you get lost in the abyss of, oh my God, this is complicated. And then you are not even an accountant yet. Did your understanding of the typical user personas, as we group them, crystallize into a very different understanding? I'm kind of setting you up here because usually what I'm talking about is that there are people.
Well, one big thing I worked on fairly early on at Stripe was just trying to provide some kind of comprehensive or cohesive documentation for users who don't code, which is a growing like percentage of like the user base at Stripe. Like I think a lot of places are just making things easier for people who don't code. Because Stripe is, or has historically been like a developer first kind of company, we've done a lot of work to make it easy for like to use code samples, to make it easy to like copy them, to like fill in different variables that you might need, like your publishable key and things like that. So it just really, like, if you're coding, it's a pretty good experience overall. But if you don't code, which is, like I said, is like more and more users were starting to do that. So we were seeing comments like in our CSAT feedback where many users were just complaining about like, I don't code, this code is not for me. So that's when I started putting together kind of a decision guide for them, and which is kind of just a high level, or I guess kind of this middle level document that kind of just goes through and kind of tries to define these different kind of common use cases and then kind of explain the typical tasks that you would need to do to accomplish each one. And sometimes kind of like you have to do a couple things together, but just trying to simplify that. So I guess to get back to your question, it's really important to understand who the users are and what they're wanting to do when they get to your site. And also, like you said, there's going to be different users. Like even for Stripe, there's like all these kind of shades of nuance. It goes from these kind of very non-technical users who really just want the UI and get really uncomfortable if they get outside of that, to very like experienced developers who really just want to know, go to the API reference, and they don't really even honestly want to use a guide or anything like that. They just use the API reference to get their mental model from it. And that's definitely a challenge to kind of trying to balance, because there's different types and amounts of information that each one of those users will want depending on who they are and what they're trying to do.
Before we go into further weeds, just to be sure, so there's no way of advocating for starting with this middle layer, that the reference docs, the tutorials, that the guys, those are table stakes. They must be there. They have to be absolutely perfect. But then for wayfinding, you can start building the guidance for people who, so you were showing different sorts of feedback, and it was this funny dichotomy between there's too many options. My option is not documented. And both of them are true at the same time. And so that you start to serve that need of recognizing your use case or something similarly applicable and then going down there before you try to implement something because maybe it's too hard going for you and you're afraid of going wrong. Not just about no code. This is also about wayfinding that you're advocating for.
Yes, because that was another thing from the feedback that I was seeing was that it was most obvious with the no-code users who they were searching for how to do something and they landed on a page and it maybe explained how to do what they wanted, but it was just using code samples, which was not helpful to them. Yeah, so I guess I think the challenge is really most users are coming from search. They'll probably search the internet, use Google, and eventually maybe land somewhere, maybe on like kind of a deep, detailed level doc. So I think the challenge there is to figure out how to put in like escape hatches and things like that to those deep level docs. So like if the wrong type of user ends up there, they're able to get back to a place where they could kind of like get some breathing room and see a little bit better view of like the whole system of like what they might want to do, as opposed to staying in the weeds of the code.
You were giving a very interesting example when I asked you what kind of questions I may ask about the project where you worked on taxes and how the regulations, rules, everything is very, very location dependent. So you can't take people straight into the implementation nitty-gritty because first, so there's these 2 dimensions and both of them are very complicated details where you have to find what applies. And you can go into this from 2 different, say, filterings. And that you applied a way of showing information through, okay, what's your tax residency or what tax residency are you interested in implementing this for? And can you tell me a bit more about that? And how does this connect to understanding people's needs in a different way?
Right. So we have like the tax product at Stripe. And part of taxes, you have to understand different like rules and regulations, your obligations, thresholds, where to register. So what we had previously was an understandable way to organize that, which is we had a page about registrations and we had a filter for finding the country. And so you could find your country and then see where you needed to register. We also had another page about your obligations and the same kind of thing. We had some kind of filter or drop-down menu to find your country and then you could find your obligations. And same thing for a threshold and so on. So I think there's 5 or 6 kind of key pieces of information that you need to know regarding, accepting what you need to do when you're accepting payments and what to do with that tax. And we had a page for each one of those, but one of the product managers saw this and kind of came up with the idea that we should probably flip it because instead of making a user visit 5 or 6 different pages and kind of keep notes, we could just create one page for each country and that would have all the information that you need for that country. And it would be, so instead of going to 6 pages, you just go to the one page and you have everything you need. So I think this was a little unintuitive because it ended up that we created, I think it was like over 100 new pages of docs, which seems like generally not something you'd want to do because you always end up with just too many docs one way or another. But in this case, I think it was the right thing for the user experience because, like I said, it's now everything is centralized and it really aligns more with what users are trying to do rather than thinking through. It makes sense from a technical writer point of view to have an obligations page and then you have like the country filter, but it's just sort of the accretion of these different things that I think as that product got more complex, it kind of required like a slightly different way of thinking to kind of make sure it was a good user experience.
Do you see a reflection of being convinced that this is the right thing to do in what you measure on user behavior? How do you verify this? You do have a lot of pages, so the statistics evens out any kind of no, that's a fluke. So you have a lot of data. Okay, I'm really fishing for what you're measuring, but I don't know how much you can tell about that.
Yeah, no, it's really tricky because, we do have a lot of data, a lot of metrics that we can look at. It's tricky because honestly, I think figuring out the right metrics for docs in general is kind of tricky. It's just like, how do you know a doc is good, So, you can measure things like page views, drop-off rates, like kind of like click rates, like where they click in the page and things like that. I think the most useful thing, just trying to understand like where users are coming from, before they get to a particular page, especially like an important page that we hope is working for users, like a decision level guide or something like that. How do they get there? And then where do they go next after that? And then also if they're going to a page that is linked to from the decision guide, let's say, that's probably a good sign. And then also you can measure things like, did they accept their first payment within 7 days after visiting that document or something like that. So I think those are the things that are really the most telling, but it could be difficult to get the right mix of metrics to really understand like what you're going for. I mean, sometimes it's very straightforward. Like if you have a product and you just want to increase growth, if you just want more people to use it, get more attention, like page views are a pretty good way to understand that. So it takes a lot of like kind of like tweaking with the metrics and also kind of working with other like the product teams and other teams that are kind of have similar goals to kind of make sure we're kind of covering all the bases. Talk to like our support team a lot too, to like understand why people are contacting support after they visit docs, for instance. Like what docs did they visit before they opened like a support ticket is a pretty good investigation path. So.
And with the traffic that you have, once a new doc set, like a different mindset of docs, let's say a new middle layer where there wasn't a middle layer is up, how long do you collect the behavior until you say, okay, now we have enough information to actually evaluate this instead of, for instance, maybe pulling the plug too early?
Yeah, and I think it takes some time, especially for kind of introducing new information architecture kind of paths, I think, to really understand partly like what we expect out of it for the users. So it's kind of what success looks like. With a simpler like tutorial or something, you could say maybe like, did the user make some of these like key API requests, and you could track that. And if they did, and then they went live within 30 days, that's like a fairly good metric. But yeah, with this kind of content, it's a little squishier in a way, that it's not quite as straightforward, that it's not like, okay, you read this, then we know you're going to make this API request, or you're going to do this in the dashboard, because it's not necessarily like directly instructing the user to do a thing. It's just helping them think through something. I guess, so all that said, I think we're working on running some A/B experiments to kind of hopefully understand a little bit more how these kind of changes are helping users or not. That requires some setup and kind of to get that data going.
Okay, so I forgot to ask in the very beginning to put all of that you have said, put into the context. Roughly, how many API endpoints are we talking about? Who's on the tech writer team, or what team are you in? How many people are you, and who, if we're talking typical corporate setup, which team? Who owns the portal? Is it marketing? Is it DevRel? Is it tech writers? Is it maybe in IT? Who owns the portal? Who's running this?
So yeah, the overall docs team is, I think, I want to say somewhere around 25 people right now. And a good portion of that is engineers who work on like the actual site and like kind of, which is really great because we have people, if we want to change how callouts look or how they function, for instance, we could work with that team to kind of give that update, and then they're coming out with like their own ideas. And so that's a great part of it. And then we have like the technical writers who are writing the content. And then we work really closely with the teams that are building the product and just other teams that interact with users and developers. So kind of like I mentioned, support, DevRel, solution architects, all these people have really good feedback from their corner of the world. And everyone seems very motivated to kind of really put users first and really kind of make it a good user experience overall. So I think that makes collaboration kind of easier, because ultimately like everyone's just, they want to make things better, and everyone's kind of looking for where the pain points are for users and how to get rid of those and how to make things more seamless and have less friction.
Who's doing the A/B testing, and which colleagues of yours are running the running user interviews?
There's a dedicated research team at Stripe, which is great, and they do really good work. And we in the docs team have like run our own UXR studies, and with like the product marketing team too, that we work really closely with them as well. And I think they're the ones that are actually driving some of the experimentation. Yeah. So again, I think that's just sort of like the goals are aligned, so it works really well to kind of like collaborate with these different teams.
Mm-hmm. Now, let me take you back to that how to show taxation rules. There's two different ways of getting there. Example, I asked you before, what is on your mind lately? What are you busy with? is a professional person. And you said something very interesting. You were referring to Sarah Moore's post. I think this came out in end of December last year, 2023, December.
Yes, I think
She
so.
was writing her thoughts and suggestions and the loopholes and pros and contras about presenting docs in a graph system, like a multi-hierarchy. I think that's how we should call it, graphs, and how it's not that easy, maybe not really good for rendering, but that the thought is valid and that you're fascinated with this and you're very interested. Now, can you connect this for me? So, because if I understand correctly, you are now seeing docs more like an information architect also, and also you're more thinking about user journeys. So this is right up your alley. Do you start thinking about the docs that you have to present and keep in shape differently after you read that article? And in what way?
So I think a lot of times when people talk about information architecture, and I'm guilty of this too, definitely, people tend to think about kind of rearranging the left-hand nav. So it means that like we have a different parent page, different like parent-child relationship, or we have one child page or like nested 3 pages, things like that. That like I think
the logic of rendering.
Right, which is it's important, and it's good to like kind of try to get that right. And it's definitely important as a writer because you're in the file system, and I think you tend to think like that. But for users, that's one thing from talking to users that discovered they don't look at the left hand nav. They search, they land on a page, they look through that page. Sometimes maybe they'll kind of look at other pages nearby, but that structure that I think we like kind of sweat over so much oftentimes is relatively meaningless to users. Mm-hmm. So I think that's part of why the idea of like graphs kind of appealed to me, because I think that is probably closer to how users actually kind of traverse doc sites, because they just kind of go from one thing to another without thinking too much about how it's necessarily logically structured.
We as people are sort of used to living our lives in a multi-dimensional complexity. But if someone asked us to draw it, we would pull a blank and we would put a highly simplified version of that. But actually, we're used to exploring the world this way. If you could avoid the rendering issues of graphs and just let people enjoy the graph, maybe that would be a way.
Yeah, I almost have a vision in my head of these 3 layers, and then you just have a bunch of the graph bubbles in the different levels, without like just kind of floating around as a way of kind of organizing content almost, and I don't know if this would work at all.
But this is not about just being innately a visual organizing, but that it's a logical. So it also becomes closer to machine understanding and accessibility issues, right?
Yeah, which is a great point, because I think with like LLMs and AI and stuff, I think what will probably become more important is kind of thinking in this way and writing in a way, I guess, kind of modular docs. So you kind of have a little bit more separation of concern, because I guess the idea is that the LLM could put these pieces together if they're kind of organized in a consistent way that's kind of like has some forethought to it, where it's these 4 bubbles on the graph actually go together, and you should probably read these in order. So yeah, but I think as long as you're kind of thinking through where your docs live in relation to like the user journey, I mean, which is easier said than done, but I think that will probably serve the kind of the AI powered future a little bit better than I think maybe like thinking through in terms of guides like we do now for the most part. Like I think we'll definitely need those still, but I think probably more than ever to tie things together, we do kind of need something like a little bit between the high level and the low level.
It might even overtake us in a way of how we are, I think, unnoticedly creating an irreversible API economy. So we are creating a digital graph of how everything works. And we're still thinking whether we want to think in graphs, but we are already thinking in graphs. It's just maybe the seeing through the multidimensional matrix is the issue here, because we're so used to this 2 or 3 dimensions thing.
Right, and I guess it's almost to like if you go down like a rabbit hole on the internet, if you're like kind of looking through Wikipedia, you just end up going, you click from one thing and get really deep on another thing, or jump into some very specific topic. I mean, it is, like you said, it's sort of like how we navigate the world now. than like this kind of structured, I guess, like kind of book-based, manual-based idea of docs, which I think is not really, I don't know how many people still think about things like that, but I think we're getting further and further away from that.
It's my pet peeve, but I think the school system is a lot to blame for. Like if they would get away from Euclidean geometry, they would go further. But okay.
I'd like to hear more about that another time. But
yeah, the other interesting thing that you said you're thinking a lot about was kind of pushing through your own obstructions or physical limitations and enduring things that you didn't think you could. And you were mentioning the idea of the second wind from William James. Now, some people might think that technical writing or technically documenting the product is taking a lot of second winds to go through and to keep maintaining it. But where are you with that? And what is the limit that you want to push professionally and maybe personally, if you want to talk about that?
Partly, I saw this movie Naiad, which is about Diana Naiad, like the endurance long distance swimmer who she swam from Cuba to Florida, which is like 90 miles, and I think it took her like 60 hours. And she's done other like incredible, like she swam the English Channel like when she was younger. So she's done these like incredible endurance things that like I could never ever get anywhere close to. But I really admire that kind of spirit in a way.
And in your life, where would that spirit come out?
So I'm very lucky in that I live a pretty comfortable life, I guess. So I think part of what I want to take from that is just not succumbing to the comfort too much, I guess, to really like kind of like challenge myself and do things that are outside of my comfort zone, even they're not going to be to this level of, commitment or endurance or anything like that. But just, like do more non-technical writing, for instance, like trying to do something more creative or just taking anything to like the next level. Like maybe
you're going to find yourself being in the manager position real soon.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess just generally just kind of like pushing myself just at least a little bit more and kind of taking as somewhat inspiration these people who push themselves to these incredible heights. And I guess it's just as far as kind of like everyday work stuff. Like, yeah, actually, I don't know. With thinking through like a second wind, yeah, I think I'll have to think a little bit more about that and how it like relates to like burnout, because I think it's important to have that balance, I think. And I think one thing he talks about in that little excerpt is that kind of a point that you were making earlier is that people are different. People are people. Mm-hmm. So some people are going to have more resiliency to kind of have the second wind or a third wind or fourth wind. And there are these exceptional people that could really like marshal their resources to do something incredible, but those are exceptional people. It's not something that you should accept from everyone, even if you have kind of the same innards in a way. Basically kind of taking that as inspiration and like that I think we all have capacity within us that we probably don't realize.
I think so too. Even if it's not some spectacular physical achievement, I do believe that in our own way, we are all doing something in our head. And top sporters, especially people who do unbelievable physically hard things afterwards, they often say it's all in your head.
Yes.
Obviously, you prepare physically, but they say the real deal is in your head.
Yes, yeah. And that's just going back to Diana Nayad, that's like, she like memorized like different songs and kind of like got it so like each stroke was like a beat and like how many songs she had to memorize to swim a certain time and things like that. So yeah, it's the mental challenge I think is much harder. And I think that's, and I guess I should also say that like, I think for a lot of people, like stretching, like it could just be like going outside, going to the store. For some people, that's like stretching their zone of comfort or whatever. So I guess just being comfortable with that everyone has their own limits and capacities.
Yeah. And for others, it's learning detail because it's time. If you want to do graph.
Yes, for the poor people that have to learn data.
Ryan, is there some closing thought that you would like to round up the conversation with and leave the listeners?
I keep on going back to it, but just the point that you had made that the people you're writing for are people. They're at the end of the day. And I think it's good to just kind of have that in mind when you're writing docs for them, that they're people like you that are trying to do something. Yeah. And I guess one reason I think I like this career, this role is like writing good docs could help people and at least make their day a little bit better. And that's hard to see because you're not seeing the user, except if you maybe like talk to someone in the user interview. But even then, you're not seeing like always the benefit of your work. But I think it's there. But I guess to kind of keep that in mind.
Thank you for the conversation and for telling us about the layer cake. And I encourage everyone who hasn't heard your presentation before, check it out in the Write the Docs archives, right? You find it in the 2023 Portland collection.
Yes.
Thank you again, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the API the Docs podcast. We thank our colleagues at Pronovix Developer Portals for letting us work on this, and the entire API community for all of the mutual support and sharing of experiences that you give each other. Do you have a topic or guest that you would like us to spotlight? Drop a note at podcast@pronovix.com. If you go to the website apithedocs.org, you can find the recaps and recordings of past API the Docs conferences, as well as the upcoming program. Until next time, be well.